For Hype Plus, this is Jay Carrington, aka JC. In the early days of colonial America, liberation came at a hefty price for Black Americans. As we all know, Black people worked their entire lives for free, and if they were lucky, they could work to buy themselves out of slavery through a process called manumission, which literally meant purchasing your own freedom. Manumitted Blacks would work for the lowest of possible wages and spend literal fortunes to purchase their husbands, wives, mothers, sisters, children, along with a house and some land to literally own their own family members. Buying oneself or their loved ones out of bondage was oftentimes the only way to keep your family and your friends safe. And safe for Black Americans in a time of slavery being an extremely subjective and uncertain thing. And while the process of manumission was perfectly legal in some states, oftentimes it was not legal for a formerly trafficked person to buy freedom for other slaves. And to add insult to injury, owners who freed their slaves and or recently manumitted slaves were often required to leave their state of origin. So with this foundation laid, in this video we're going to discuss the lives of 5 Black people and 1 family that bought and sold other Black people. And some of these people did it out of love, some people did it out of spite, but all of these individuals, with the exception of 2, did it for personal gain. Our hope is that this piece informs you not only on the history of Black slave ownership and human trafficking in the US, but most importantly, the way that colorism, white supremacy, capitalism, and worst of all, greed has shaped the entire American landscape. Let's begin. Our first 2 stories are going to feature a woman named Dilsey Pope and a boy named Jacob Gaskin. According to historycollection.com, Dilsey was a recently self-manumitted Black woman from Columbus, Georgia. She was able to purchase land, a house, and even the freedom of her enslaved husband. Now, you would think that after all of this, these 2 would settle, have some kids, and live happily ever after. Well, as happy as a life could be when you were Black and living in a country that literally saw you as either a work meal or a dollar bill, but I digress. All was going well until, as couples do, the 2 got into a huge argument. In a fit of rage, Dilsey makes a decision that changes both of their lives forever. She decides to sell her husband to her white neighbor. Now, much later, after things cooled down, Dilsey realized the error of her ways and decided that she wanted her husband back. Her neighbor, unsurprisingly, declined. I mean, it's kind of like, sis, you literally just had to buy both you, yourself, and your husband from white people that you just sold your husband back to. What the hell did you think was going to happen? Secondly, in the case of Jacob Gaskin, we have another family having run-of-the-mill family issues that escalated way too quickly. According to Wattpad.com, Jacob Gaskin was fortunate enough to be born free because his mother was a free Black woman, and it's unclear whether it was by birth or by manumission. Jacob's father, however, was enslaved, and as any good wife would, Jake's mom made plans to purchase him and keep the family together. So once Jake was old enough to work, he and his mother saved enough money to purchase his father's freedom. But an important detail to note here is, although both parties paid for Jacob's father, Jacob was the only party listed as the sole purchaser, making him the only legal owner of his father. And as the sole owner, he had complete control over his father's freedom. And I bet you don't need Google Maps to see where this is headed. So one day, as kids do, young Jake did something that caused his father to reprimand him. And according to the Confederate Historical Association of Belgium, Jake decides to get revenge on his dad by selling him to a human trafficker in New Orleans. Oh no, it gets worse. After the sale, young Jake is quoted to have bragged to his friends. The old man had gone down to the cornfields in New Orleans where they might learn him some manners. Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you Jacob Gaskin, the undisputed king of petty, and Dilsey Pope, the historical embodiment of, you right. Next on our list is a family that proves the saying, all your skin folk ain't your kinfolk. The Pendarvis family of South Carolina is our next story. And what makes this family particularly notable is the fact that they were one of the most prominent and wealthy slave-owning families, Black or white, in all of the southern colonies. According to historycollection.com, in the early 1600s, a white plantation owner named Joseph Pendarvis, who at the time was married to Elizabeth Pendarvis, remember that for later, took an enslaved woman named Parthena as his mistress. Now, whether or not Parthena was actually in love with Joe, or recognized that Joe's infatuation was her ticket out of enslavement, is debatable. But what isn't up for debate is the 7 kids that Joe and Parthena conceived. So later in life, when Joe dies, due to an ironic and unintended clause in Joseph's will, the illegitimate children of Parthena and not his wife Elizabeth end up receiving all of Joseph's inheritance in 1694. This left Parthena's eldest son, James Pendarvis, with over 1,000 acres of land and a separate plantation that housed over 110 enslaved Africans. This made James the largest non-white slaveholder in the entire state of North Carolina. And now I know what you're thinking. There's no way that this man, whose own mother resembled one of the people who had been forced to work the fields in this very plantation, would keep this plantation, right? Are you dumb? Are you new here? Are you hourly? Did you not read the brochures that they had on the Mayflower cruise ship? We bought that coin, baby. This is America. So the Pendarvis clan not only continued the family business of cotton farming and human trafficking, but they literally tripled their net worths. According to Maryland.gov, when James Pendarvis died in 1798, the family owned 3 plantations spanning over 3,200 acres and 155 enslaved humans. Their wealth and land owning continued well into the late 1800s, making them one of the most prominent and wealthy families in the entire Southeast. And while there isn't much information on the Pendarvis' treatment of the people working their plantation, given the dual politics of colorism and capitalism, I highly doubt it was pleasant. So this next story is probably one of the worst on the list, and it features a man by the name of Nathaniel Butler. Not much is known about the early life of Nate Butler, just that he was a self-manumitted slave that settled in Hartford County, Maryland. But what makes Nathaniel particularly unique and cruel was the way that he made his living after freeing himself from bondage. You see, this dude would literally trick, entrap, or kidnap other black people and then ransom them to the highest bidder. Yeah, you heard that right. Escaped slaves would come to his property by accident or on purpose, seeking shelter and safe passage. Butler would then contact any plantation owners in the surrounding area to see if they had any missing property. Once confirmed, Butler would ask the former owners how much were they willing to pay. And if the price was too low, Butler would literally go to auction and traffic the people, the black people, the people that looked just like him on his property, to the highest bidder. Yo, there is a special Uncle Ruckus, Sam Jackson in the Django, Florida man from Queen and Slim size place in hell for this dude. His business dealings were so ruthless that even other white human traffickers and plantation owners felt that he was cruel and abusive. Like, fam, how horrible of a human being do you have to be that the white people that literally started this business are like, look, man, I know I make a living ripping apart families, torturing people, and selling defenseless women and children, but I ain't as bad as Nate Butler. Unsurprisingly, there were numerous, and I do mean numerous, assassination attempts carried out by other black people on Nate Butler's life, but unfortunately, somehow, he always came out alive. And it's unclear what became of Nate Butler, but I think I join everyone in wishing him a very long, slow, agonizingly painful fall off a short cliff. Next, we have Antoine Dubuque of Baton Rouge. And before we go any further, I feel like we gotta break down the racial hierarchy that existed in colonial Louisiana at the time. So the French claimed and settled this state long before it became a part of America in the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. This led to the people in the region being separated into 3 distinct classes: white, colored, and black. Colored people were mixed race, and their lighter skin and looser curl patterns afforded them all the privileges of middle and upper class society. Colored Louisianans had access to education, land, business ownership, and even the opportunity to hold public office. They were truly separate and almost equal, so much so that their privileges challenged even the status of their white counterparts. Antoine Dubuque was one of these colored individuals. He was born in 1810, and he was the son of 2 other free colored people. And according to Wattpad.com, his father was part owner in a sugar plantation called Cedar Grove. And unlike some of the other black folks on this list, saying decisively whether his motives were good or bad becomes really, really difficult. I know, shouldn't be hard to condemn anyone that participates in human trafficking regardless of color, but you gotta stay with me here. According to FrenchCreoles.com, in 1836, Antoine married Claire Pollard, another free woman of color whose family also were plantation owners in Point Coupe, Louisiana. And after Antoine's father died, he was able to assume complete control of the Cedar Grove plantation. By 1860, Antoine had managed to make it one of the largest sugar plantations in all of Louisiana, housing right around 100 enslaved humans. At his most successful, historians estimate Dubuque's net worth at $265,000. This might not sound like a lot in today's money, but in the 1800s, that was 200 times the average income of the state of Louisiana. This made Dubuque one of the richest men, white or black, in the South. And again, I know that amassing large quantities of wealth using enslaved humans that worked for free is a pretty clear example of white supremacist capitalism. However, this is where the story gets interesting. When the Civil War caused sugar markets to plummet, the Dubuques managed to keep a large portion of their wealth through investments made from Claire and Antoine's plantation holdings. His money management is important because when Reconstruction began, Antoine was nominated and then elected to be the Republican Louisiana State Treasurer. So let's pull over here. Yes, Fox News is technically correct. The Republican Party did actually free the slaves. And by default, this makes the Republicans the party that fought for black liberation at the time. So many of the Southern Confederate states went bankrupt after losing the Civil War. And we're gonna pull over one more time. I just want to reiterate that the South lost terribly. That the people that wanted to own slaves and continue this country's legacy of human trafficking lost by like a lot. You hear me, Florida? So whether Dubuque ran for office out of moral obligation for black or colored people, or whether he viewed his financial fate intertwined with the state of Louisiana is pretty unclear. But what we do know is that Dubuque had an impressive 11-year run as state treasurer, single-handedly keeping the state of Louisiana out of financial hardship. And last but not least, I saved the worst of the worst for last. This story is dedicated to Anthony Johnson, one of the primary legal reasons that enslaved Africans remain enslaved in America. Yeah, you heard that right. A black man is partly responsible for the legal entrenchment of human trafficking and/or enslavement of other Africans in the United States. So before we talk about Anthony, let's discuss the American history that absolutely no white one wants to talk about. You know, the one that runs parallel to the popular marketing campaign that America would like you to believe. Pilgrims, Mayflower, Thanksgiving, all that jazz. So America was Great Britain's versions of Alcatraz. That's right. The King and Queen of England sent its prisoners to the New World to do manual labor as punishment. And if you think that this is just some liberal talking point, the only reason that we call Australia, Australia, is because after American convicts pulled one of the largest jailbreaks in world history, i.e. the American Revolution, Britain had to find another place to send its felons. Now, here in the United States of Alcatraz, there were prisoners of all colors and ethnicities. And while serving your time, you were temporarily stripped of your freedom under a process called indentured servitude. And as with most jails, once you completed your bid, you were granted the choice of either returning back to Europe or staying in the New World and establishing a life in the place that you literally helped build. However, it should come as a shock to absolutely no black one that's lived in this country for longer than 5 minutes that indentured Africans could and oftentimes would be subjected to different legal standards in court due to the question of British and/or European citizenship. Racism, man. It always has and it always will be the thing that America runs on. Sorry, Duncan. According to the African American History Society, or AAHS.com, the legalities surrounding the words servant and slave were undefined and interchangeable before the 1800s. And this is where the landmark case of Anthony Johnson comes into play. According to AAHS.com, Anthony Johnson, originally named Antonio, is reported to be the first African indentured servant to arrive in the colony of Virginia. Once Anthony was freed in 1651, he was awarded a 250-acre plantation with both white and black servants. This makes Johnson the first black man to own slaves or servants in the American colonies. And I have to wonder, does this count as a PPP loan, a grant, or a government-sponsored startup? Anyway, just 3 years after launching his startup, Johnson was involved in a legal dispute with his neighbor over a black servant named John Casor. Casor alleged that his time of servitude for Anthony ended and that he was serving another concurrent sentence under the ownership of Anthony's neighbor. Johnson argued that his claim over Casor was not servitude, which was temporary, but one of permanence, which is slavery. And apparently, Virginia state courts agreed. They promptly returned John Casor into the care of Anthony Johnson, and I quote, for life. Now, right-wing pundits will argue that this is the landmark case that defines slavery in America. However, and might I add, as usual, they're wrong. So on July 9th, 1640, 6 years before Anthony Johnson even landed on Virginia shores, a white man named Hugh Wynn was the first person to be awarded lifelong ownership or slavery over a black man named John Punch. Punch, alongside 2 white indentured servants named John and James Gregory, were caught during a jailbreak. Upon returning to court, John, a Dutchman, and James, a Scottishman, were only given an extra year added to their sentence. Punch, an African, was given, and I quote, enslavement for the term of his natural life. This case, combined with that of Anthony Johnson, are the two landmark decisions that shaped the legalities surrounding African slavery and human trafficking in the United States of America. And so, in conclusion, we give you this information not as an attempt to absolve or make white Americans feel better about their ancestors' participation in the legacy of slavery and human trafficking in the US. And we damn sure ain't trying to do it to make black people look bad in the eyes of our peers or others. We give you this information so that all who view it can understand the way that white supremacist capitalism, yes, SAT words, I know, but they're very important, has shaped the American landscape as a whole. How it established an ecosystem where even those who were direct descendants and or victims themselves of slavery and human trafficking had no other choice but to participate in, to survive, and be successful in this country. And lastly, we hope that this lesson in American history, because even though it features Black Americans, the keyword is American, can help to shed some light on the decisions being made in this country now and then the future. For Hype Plus News, I am Jay Carrington, aka JC, a free-ish black man in the USA. And in the words of the esteemed poet, scholar, and Emmy Award-winning screenwriter, Donald Glover, this is America. Peace.